Pax Transhumanity imagines an optimistic near-future world in which technology helps humanity overcome our limitations. Designed by Matt Eklund, who co-designed one of my all-time faves, Pax Porphyriana, Pax Transhumanity sees you commercializing cutting-edge new technologies to solve global problems. Each of the 111 idea cards is like its own little episode of Black Mirror, complete with the designer's dad, Phil Eklund's ruthless Randian politics in the footnotes.
For the setup, lay out the sphere placards, First World, Developing World, Cloud and Space, with their corresponding problem chits above, and put the market cost markers to make 6 rows, 5 through to 0. Put out the human progress splay and the regime cards with globalization at the top. Deal out 38 cards from the deck. Take the top card and put the left-hand colour on the human progress splay. And then deal out the starting market. 6 cards in the first world, 6 cards in the developing world, 1 card in the cloud and 1 card in space, corresponding to the market cost chits. With the remaining cards, take the 4 tipping point cards and the plurality card. Shuffle those 4 tipping point cards into the bottom half of that deck. Put the plurality card face up on the bottom. Put that back on top and that's your draw deck. Give each player a finance board. For 2 players, player 1 is blue, player 2 is red. For 3 players, insert pink. For 4 players, insert black. In that order. Give each player their starting agents according to the dots on their capital, wealth and debt boxes. And each player gets a starting patent. Look at the colours on the patents card to see where they go. The rest of the cubes and discs are kept aside for now. Finally, deal each player 2 cards from the unused cards. They will look at them, pick one of the colours that is available and put it secretly underneath their board. The other 2 cards just get discarded. Cubes mean different things depending on where they are. If they're on your player board, they are money. Here they're patents. Here they're workers, commercial workers, research workers, or this one can serve as either a commercial or a research worker. They can be black heat or white heat. Those represent the unintended consequences of new technologies. Or they can be syndication cubes. While a card is syndicated, if that card has a special power on it, that player has access to that special power. If you ever need to spend money, you spend money by moving one of your money cubes down by 1 box. So for example, putting this cube from wealth into debt, that's 1 money. Putting this from capital into wealth, that's 1 money. I could put this one all the way down, that's 2 money. If I ever have to move one of these agents into a different position, I always take it from the top. There's another way to spend money. If you ever need to spend money, you can use patents instead. Each patent is worth however many of that colour are in the human progress splay. So there are 3 greens in here. That means that each of these patents is worth $3. But there are no blues in here, so this is worth nothing. You don't get change though, so if you only needed to spend $2 and you spend one of these, it just gets spent.
There's a lot of terminology in this next section, which is about the commercialization action. Just let it wash over you at this point. I go over all the actions again later in the video, and after that it should make more sense.
Now I fast forwarded the game a little bit. Each turn you're going to do 2 actions from the list on your player board. The most important action and the most complicated, and basically what you're trying to do for most of the game, is commercialize. In order to commercialize a card, in order to commercialize one of these technologies, first it has to be viable. This particular technology is a yellow-blue technology, designated by the strips on either side of the card. There are several different ways that it can be viable. The first way is if exactly that pair of colours is visible on the human progress splay. Here you can see blue and yellow are together on the human progress splay, so all blue-yellow cards are viable. However, if that wasn't the case, You can also make it viable by spending patents of those colours. So red has a blue and yellow patent, those can be spent, these cubes go back into the wealth box, and that makes a blue-yellow card viable. The third way that a blue-yellow card can be viable is if a blue-yellow card is on top of your think tank stack. The colours have to match exactly. So we've established that this blue-yellow card is viable. Is it syndicated? Red has a cube on it, so yes, it is syndicated. Then you have to pay the barrier cost. The barrier cost is how many of these stop signs are visible in that sphere. At the moment, one stop sign is visible. Multiply that by 2, that's how much you have to pay. Now red has to use a worker, a maker worker. Red has a maker worker here, so just move that down. It's now unemployed. And now finally this card is commercialized. So what that means is, so first these three things happen. Red is going to put this on the blue side into the human progress splay. So the blue lightning happens. That means that all players lose their blue patents. That's going to go into the wealth box on the blue player's board. And one blue technology gets removed from the human progress splay, but there isn't one. And red solves the interface problem. That's potentially worth points at the end of the game. And red gets another worker from his bag, and that'll go into the wealth. Now red is going to put this card into the human progress splay, and the two cubes that were on it, this syndication cube becomes a patent of that colour. Red is going to put this blue colour facing up, and this cube that was on the heat becomes future shock. There are 4 different ways that a game can end. In approximate order of how commonly it happens, a player builds their 5th company. In this case, red has 4 companies, so if he builds a 5th, the game is immediately a red victory. Or someone commercializes a tipping point, which has this symbol on it, which would end the game. Another way it can end is if there are 5 cards of the same color in a row on the human progress splay. And the final way that the game can end is if this plurality card gets researched out of the market, which basically means you've used up all the cards. As the game progresses, technology cards in the market will be commercialized and added to the bottom of the human progress splay. Sometimes a card might also be removed from the progress splay. The last 3 cards in the splay determine the current regime, and victory points are awarded differently depending on what regime is in play when the end game is triggered. Usually, you'll get points for solved problems and companies, or you could get points from future shock. Alternatively, you win immediately if you ever build a 5th company. To determine what regime you're in during the game, you always look at the last 3 cards of the human progress splay. If the last 3 cards in the human progress splay are different, the regime is globalization. While the regime is globalization, all work in the developing world is subsidized.
If the game end is triggered during this regime,
each player will get 1 point for each problem or company of the same color as the one in their hidden sphere. In red's case, that's yellow. So red would get no points for having solved this problem, but 1 point from having this company. If 2 out of the last 3 cards on the human progress splay are blue, the regime immediately changes to cloud, which means that during the game, research has no barrier cost, blue patents are worth double, and if the game ends while the regime is blue, only blue solved problems and companies count. 2 points each. So in this case, red has 4 points. If 2 out of the last 3 cards on the human progress splay are green, as is the case here, the regime automatically switches to developing world, which means during the game that hiring costs 0, green patents are worth double, and if the regime is green at the end of the game, each green company or problem is worth 2 points. If 2 out of the last 3 cards are orange, the regime automatically switches to space, commercialization is subsidized, orange patents are worth double, and if the game ends now, orange companies and problems are worth 2 victory points each. Now if 2 cards out of the last 3 are yellow, the regime switches to first world, surge arrow icons of both colors exist on every card, these are surge arrow icons. Yellow patents are worth double, and if the game ends while we're in the yellow regime, yellow companies owned and yellow problems solved are worth 2 victory points each. Finally, if all three cards at the bottom of the human progress splay are the same colour, the regime switches to paradigm shift, in which case it's always free to syndicate cards, all patents are worth double, and if the game ends while the regime is in paradigm shift, the only thing that counts for any points is future shock, worth 1 point each. So in this case, red is the only one with any future shock and would win. Having future shock is often a bad thing because it locks up your agents, but if the game ends with this regime, that can help you win, and these also help you survive nuclear war. There are nuke icons on the tipping points that happen if the tipping point gets commercialized. Each turn you can do 2 actions. The first action here is fundraiser. This is how you can get some money back. First of all, any cubes anywhere that are not on the black or white heat squares can be removed and returned to the wealth box of your board. That's optional. And then you do capital accumulation. For each cube in your capital, you move up 1 cube in your debt, and then you move all of the cubes in your wealth up to capital. That'll give you a lot more money to spend now. The next option is syndicate. You'll need to syndicate a technology before you can commercialize it. To syndicate, you look at the card that you want to syndicate, check the market cost, pay that much money, 1, 2, 3, 4, and then take a cube from the top of your board and put it on that card. If the card has any white heat on it, you'll also need to take another cube and cover up that white heat. That represents an unintended consequence of developing that technology. If the card had any surge arrows on it, this one doesn't, but this one does, then you could syndicate an additional card above it, which included that colour, for free. If you wanted to syndicate a card that has already been syndicated by another player, then you need to double the market cost. So syndicating here would cost 4. The other thing to say is that if you've syndicated a card with a special power on it, then as long as you have a syndication cube on there, that special power applies to you. The next option is commercialize. We went over that earlier. In this case, the only card that red has syndicated is this yellow-orange one, and yellow-orange is not viable for red because he has no yellow-orange patents to spend. There's no pair of yellow-orange in the human progress splay, and red's think tank is not a yellow-orange card. So red can't commercialize here. No viability. The next action is hire. That's how you get workers. You'll need workers to research or commercialize. To hire, you pay 3. 1, 2, 3. Then you take the top cube from your finance board and put it into one of the spheres. You can't put it where there's already another player's cube. If you put it on this side, it's going to be a maker worker, which lets you commercialize. And if you put it on this side, it'll be a research worker. Or I could put it here in the middle, in which case it's either. Also here, because I've put it on my own company, that doesn't actually cost me an action, so I would still have 2 actions left on my turn. Workers can also go in these spots, which can be shared by multiple players, but they're less good because if you use a worker from here, you'll get no patent when you commercialize or research. The next action that you can take is research. This is how you get more patents or a think tank card, which will help you with viability in order to be able to commercialize. First you need to pay the barrier cost. So let's say I'm going to research here in the first world. The barrier cost is currently 1, which I have to multiply by 2 unless it's subsidized. So I'd pay that too. But hang on, wait. If the worker I'm using is on a company that I own, that work is subsidized as well. So in this case I only need to pay 1. I then expend a research worker, move down one of these arrows, now he's unemployed. I'll discard the bottom card from this sphere, move these cards down, and then refill. Now that card that I discarded, in this case is a double yellow, so I can either take 2 yellow patents, which I would take from the top of my finance board, or instead of taking 2 yellow patents, I could take this as a think tank. Now all double yellow cards are viable for me in future. However, I had to cover up the one underneath. Also, if this card had a special power, this one doesn't, while it's in my think tank, I have that special power. The The next action I can take is placate heat. That just lets me take one cube off a heat square here and return it to the wealth box on my finance board. And the final action that I can take is import, which allows me to move any card in the market to any other spot in the market. So for example, if I wanted to commercialize this double orange card, I could use one action to import it and move it down here, which would make it free to syndicate with my second action. There are quite a lot of these commercialization impacts, and they're all explained on the back of the rulebook. I'll go over a few of the ones I can see. These mean that you'll solve problems. You'll just take those chits as long as they're still available and put them next to your board, and they might be worth points at the end of the game. These are really important. This is how you get a company. In this case, a research company in the blue sphere. In fact, specifically ID theft, and because it's got an exclamation mark, that means that you can kick off somebody if they were already there before. This is how you get another worker from your bag into circulation, and this one means that all players will lose a worker unless when it was syndicated this black heat square was covered up. You always have the option when you're syndicating to cover black heat squares, whereas the white ones you have to cover up. This one lets you take a cube off of a heat for free, and it's also the only way that you can take a cube off a future shock if you want to. All the cubes that you remove get added to your wealth. This is industry disruption, which will remove people's orange patents and take an orange card out of the human progress splay. This is a nuclear exchange. You look at how many black squares are visible in the human progress splay, and everyone loses one company and or one problem for each black square visible of that colour. Although there is a way to defend against this, which is to have one of your cubes on a black square in the human progress splay, i.e. having a future shock cube. This symbol just allows you to take any problem chit of any colour that's left, and this symbol ends the game. For the first turn, Blue's first action will be to fundraise. So there's no capital to bring up the debt, so all of this wealth just goes up and becomes capital. For Blue's second action, Blue is going to syndicate. He wants to syndicate this card, which will get it ready for commercialization later. It costs 1, so he pays 1, and he takes the top cube from his finance board and puts it on there to syndicate it. It's got a white heat, so he needs to take another cube and put it on that white heat. He can optionally cover up this black heat as well, but he's not going to. Now it's Red's turn. Red is also going to start by fundraising, so there's enough in the capital to get all of this debt up, and then all of the wealth gets pushed up, and then Red is going to spend 3 to hire a worker. 1, 2, 3. That worker has to come from the top, and he's going to put the worker here on the commercialized side. Now it's Blue's turn. For his first action, Blue is going to placate heat, which means that he can take this cube off the heat square and put it back into his wealth, and then he's going to fundraise. So there's enough capital to bring up that debt, and then all of this goes up into wealth. Red is going to hire a worker now for the first action, so that costs 1, 2, 3, and then takes that top cube and it's going to put it here in the developing world. That can serve as a researcher or a commercializer. And then for his second action, he's going to research. So he's got to pay the barrier cost, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 times 2. Well, he doesn't have 10 money, but the good news is that it's the globalization regime, which means that all work in the developing world is subsidized. So it's not times 2, it's only 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And then that worker gets used, one step, and this research happens. That gets discarded, all of these move down, and this gets replenished. This discarded one, he's going to put here as his think tank. So that means that all blue-green cards for him in future are viable for commercialization, and he also has this special power, which in this case is not going to be useful at this point in the game. Now it's Blue's turn. Blue's going to hire a worker, 1, 2, 3. That worker is going to go here, so it can be used as a researcher or a commercializer. For his second action, he's going to research. So he pays the barrier cost, 1 stop sign visible, so it's just 1 times 2 is 2. 1, 2. Then he discards this card, moves everything down, and refreshes. This card here that was discarded, he could put it into his think tank, but instead he's going to discard it and take 2 green patents, because it's green on both sides. Those green patents have to come from the top of his finance board. Now it's Red's turn. Red has hardly any money, So he's going to do fundraise twice. For the first fundraise, he's actually going to divest, take back a couple of cubes to help his wealth situation. Those cubes that he took back go into wealth. Then there's no capital to mitigate the debt, so that debt stays there and this wealth just goes up. And then for the second fundraise action, there's 3 capital to bring up 3 debt, and then all this gets pushed up. Now it's Blue's turn. Blue is going to commercialize this card. He has syndicated it, so that's okay. Is it viable? Let's see. It's a green-blue card. There's no green-blue pair in the splay, and he doesn't have a green-blue card here in his think tank, but he can spend a green and blue patent to make it viable. So he does that. The spent stuff goes back into his wealth. So now that we know it's viable and syndicated, he has to pay the barrier cost, which is 1, 2 times 2. 1, 2, 3, 4. And use up that worker. That worker is now unemployed. And now this card is commercialized. So these impacts happen. He solves disenfranchisement for the entire planet, thanks to Universal Property Directory. And he solves social immobility for the entire planet. There's also a recession, which does apply because the black heat square was not covered up. So each player has to take a top cube from their finance board and return it back to the bag. This then goes into the human progress splay. He chooses to put it on the green side, which means that this becomes a green patent. And the regime changes to green because now 2 out of the last 3 cards, in this case there are only 2 cards, are green. So now hiring costs 0. And green patents are worth double. This gap now just stays there. It won't get refilled until someone researches in this sphere. For Blue's second turn, he's going to fundraise. So divest this cube, which returns to his wealth, and then there's no capital to get the debt up, and this wealth just goes up. Now it's Red's turn. Red has his eye on commercializing this card, because it's a blue-green card, which is viable for him because he has a blue-green think tank. So he's going to want to syndicate it, but actually he's going to use his first action to import it down here into this gap, and then it's free to syndicate. And he chooses to take another cube and cover up this black heat.